everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am just thrilled this morning to have the opportunity to talk to historian Rebecca Brenner Graham. She's the author of a forthcoming book called Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins' efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. And that's what she's here to talk about with us today. Rebecca is a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University. Previously, she taught at the Madeira School and American University. She has a PhD in history and a master's in public history from American University and a BA in History and Philosophy from Mount Holyoke College. In 2023, she was awarded a Cokie Roberts Fellowship from the National Archives Foundation and a Rubenstein Center Research Fellowship from the White House Historical Association. So, Rebecca, first of all, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Mary, for inviting me.
Well, I'm really thrilled to have you here because I'm a great admirer of Frances Perkins, and this is an unknown chapter. And so next is congratulations, Rebecca, on your forthcoming book, which is very exciting. I'm happy for you.
Thank you so much. January 21st. While we're recording, we're, I guess, 8 days until pub date.
Well, that is very exciting. Absolutely. Well, Rebecca, I thought maybe we would start with some of the better-known accomplishments of Frances Perkins, although to me I don't think she's nearly as well-known as she deserves to be. But she was the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. She was FDR's Secretary of Labor. And in fact, her family homestead in Newcastle, Maine, which is only a couple of hours north of Newburyport, attained the status of being a national monument in December of this past year. Rebecca, I know this is a big question, but how would you sum up what you think are, her most important enduring legacy of contributions to American workers?
That's a great question. And like you said, it's really difficult to sum up because she did so much throughout her whole career. For the purpose of answering the question, I'll focus on her time as Secretary of Labor of the United States from 1933 to 1945. The landmark pieces of legislation that she was most integral in were in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act. It legalized strikes and the ability of workers to join a union. Also in 1935, she was integral to the Social Security Act, which aimed to provide Americans who, for various reasons that were not their fault, could not support themselves by working. And in 1938, she was integral to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established certain workplace protections, like certain number of hours that people could work, and also a minimum wage. And those were all items that she had been working on throughout her career. I just highlighted the ones that she did while she was working for the President of the United States.
In other words, Rebecca, we all owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Frances Perkins because those are things I think that people have taken for granted for a long time. And yet they weren't part of the history of American labor. If it weren't for people like both FDR, of course, and Frances Perkins. So thank you, Frances Perkins. And thank you for that nice, concise summary. Well, she was a tireless and fearless pioneering advocate for the things you just enumerated, Rebecca. Could you talk a little bit about what some of the formative influences were on Frances Perkins that led her to be such a dedicated and effective advocate on behalf of workers?
When I just mentioned the Social Security Act, I think I used the phrase people who could not support themselves for various reasons that were not their fault. And when Frances Perkins was a child in Massachusetts, her parents were, kind and loving, but relatively conservative, and they did not realize that poor people couldn't support themselves and that it wasn't their fault. They thought that maybe they weren't working hard enough, or they believed certain myths of pulling oneself up by their bootstraps. So back to the question you just asked, there are a few moments when Frances Perkins herself learned that that those conditions were not the fault of the people experiencing them. The first was when she was an undergraduate student at Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts, and her professor, Anna Maisel, took students to the mills in nearby Holyoke, Massachusetts, to witness what working conditions were like. The second was after college, she moved to Chicago, where she had a full-time job teaching high school to support herself. And she also volunteered at Hull House, the famed settlement home run by social work pioneer Jane Addams.
Yeah.
And that was the place where she worked the most directly with immigrant communities and poor people, single mothers, lots of people who needed support through reasons that were not their own fault. And then she moved back to the East Coast to continue that kind of work in a more professional, in a more, like it became her day job in a way that it hadn't been in Chicago. And while she was working in Manhattan for the National Consumers League, she had the experience or the trauma of witnessing the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the type of thing that no person wants to experience or see with their own eyes. And the workers had been begging for basic workplace protections, and their employer had not listened to them. And Perkins and people like her across the street did not want to see something like that happen again. And she in particular wondered about what are the collective and structural ways that Americans can support workers.
That's really interesting to hear about those personal influences that helped her develop an understanding that people legitimately are in need. And that Triangle Shirtwaist fire, I remember reading, I think that the employer had nailed the door shut, so the employees were unable to escape from the fire, which is just, it's painful to think about. It's such a tragedy. So there were a variety of different kinds of influences that led her to have a deep understanding and compassion for people. In other words, that became part of the driver for how she became the Frances Perkins that we owe such a debt of gratitude to, as we've been talking about. Well, Rebecca, your new book, Dear Miss Perkins, tells the story of a role that she played saving Jewish refugees during the Nazi regime, which people don't know about, and I didn't know about it, I have to admit, until I read about your book on the Frances Perkins Homestead website. How did you become aware of Perkins' role doing these things, and what made you decide that you wanted to highlight this aspect of her life?
Thank you, Mary. What's new about my book is Perkins's role in saving tens and thousands of Jewish refugees from Nazi territory. Everything I've said so far in this interview, though, I learned from a book called The Woman Behind the New Deal by Kirsten Downey, which came out from Random House in 2009. And in 2014, I interned for the Frances Perkins Center, funded by the Frances Perkins Center, but at the home in Old Town Alexandria, Virginia, of Kirsten Downey, the author of The Woman Behind the New Deal. So I was her intern over a decade ago now. And my project that summer in 2014 was to organize Kirsten's extensive research for donation to a combination of Mount Holyoke Archives and the Frances Perkins Center. And while I was working on archival organization and description at her house, she would kind of drop in and tell me about things. She was getting her kitchen done at the time, which provided lots of reason to walk through where I was. And one time when Kirsten walked in, I was reading an article that she had photocopied. I think it was called Frances Perkins and the German Jewish Refugees. It was by an Israeli historian, Bat-Ami Zucker, in like 2000, or very early 2000s. And I was just reading it. And Kirsten told me, someone should really research the refugees further.
And the rest is history.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Oh, that's great. One of the things I think people will wonder about is she was Secretary of Labor. And so why were Jewish refugees approaching the Secretary of Labor about help with immigration issues?
When Frances Perkins became Secretary of Labor in 1933, immigration was not what she thought of as her first priority. But literally, when she got to the Department of Labor building on the first day in March 1933, several different men informed her that they were in charge of immigration. And what they meant was that the Department of Labor was spinning its wheels on immigration, specifically deportation. Their goals in the Hoover administration and Hoover's Department of Labor were not to protect workers at their places of work, like the Triangle Factory. It was to deport people who were competing for American jobs. And that is literally why immigration was in the Labor Department.
Oh, interesting.
So in order to even get to the New Deal stuff, one of the first things that Frances Perkins had to do was reorganize immigration within the Department of Labor to reallocate energy and resources. So she asked President Franklin D. Roosevelt for an executive order to combine the Immigration Bureau with the Naturalization Bureau to centralize control and authority over what became known as the Immigration Naturalization Service, the INS. And the INS was in immigration was in the Labor Department from 1933 to 1940. So that is the duration of my book, 30 to 40. In 1940, FDR ended up moving it to the Department of Justice for a variety of reasons. But that is why the INS was in the Labor Department. And so people reached out to her, as I think we'll discuss next, because the INS was in the Labor Department, but also because her networks knew that she was pro-immigrant and that that was rare in the federal government.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, part of your research then was to read, I understand, Rebecca, thousands of letters addressed to Dear Miss Perkins. That's the title of your book. So what were people asking Frances Perkins to do, and how did they appeal to her for help? And I was hoping maybe you could give us an example or two of the letters that you read that may have stayed with you.
People that she knew reached out to her through these letters. And what I like about what I think of my home documents at the National Archives at College Park is you can see them increase in volume as more and more people were desperate to exit Nazi Germany in the 1930s. When people wrote to her, it was typically on behalf of a refugee. It was typically people she knew from all stages of her life and career, from across the United States and very occasionally overseas. And they asked her to intervene in immigration cases. Or sometimes they actually just asked her to explain the process. So sometimes she could help somebody by explaining clearly and carefully in a letter to someone she knew that that person actually had to exit the US and obtain a new visitor visa from Canada or Mexico or somewhere else that would let them obtain a visa. So through those letters, she was doing a combination of intervening by sending a note either to someone who worked for her or somebody she knew in a different government department, like the State Department controlled the consuls overseas. And other times she was just being a human to respond in a humane way during during a crisis.
Yeah. Well,
and you asked for an example too, so I'll give you an example. So chapter 7 of my book is called Dear Miss Perkins, which is the title of the book. The original title for that chapter was actually Visas, which is compelling. Dear Miss Perkins is the chapter that gives several examples. So I'll just pick one. There was an immigrant named Paul, and he was from Austria. He was used to supporting himself in business, but he also had a physical disability. I think it was his leg. And when he obtained a visa, like through proper measures to come to the US. I think he had a job here. And while he was trying to board the ship in Austria, the ship company said, no, you couldn't have possibly obtained those documents legally because the US doesn't welcome people with disabilities.
oh my gosh.
really said that.
Wow.
And the law of the land, according to the Immigration Act of 1917, people who had physical disabilities were not able to come to the US to work.
Oh, I did not know that. Wow. Okay.
And so she sent a note to the shipping company. So then this man, Paul, makes it to the US, and he got to Ellis Island. And at Ellis Island again, at this point, it's Labor Department payroll people through the INS at Ellis Island said, no, you couldn't possibly have obtained these papers legally because you can't work in the US, you have a physical disability. So then she again wrote to them. So she intervened in that case twice in order to ensure that the law be followed fairly, even though the law itself, super ableist. And I think it's important to highlight in this particular example that in addition to the Secretary of Labor helping this man, Paul, he also had to have a job where he could support himself. And the person who was writing to Perkins about him, I forget that person's name, but they worked at Hull House, which is how Perkins.
Oh, of course, in Chicago. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That person at Hull House was sponsoring Paul's immigration. So there had to be a job that he could do, someone who had money that said that they would support him if for some reason, for the first time in his life, he couldn't support himself. And also this patchwork system of the Secretary of Labor intervening in his case.
Well, thank goodness she was able to intervene because it made a higher difference. I'm sure it was a matter of life or death for this man. Eventually, it would have been.
So he made it, but I also include examples of people who either didn't make it to the U.S. or they didn't at all.
Wow. Well, how effective at being helpful was she, Rebecca? I mean, as you just said, some people like Paul, she was able to help, and some people she wasn't. But what kinds of things was she able to do, and also what barriers, either attitudinal or bureaucratic, did she have to overcome in order to help the people she was able to help? Because this was a time in American history which, you know, immigration was not easy. People's attitudes about it were not always positive.
She was working within a system in which the odds were stacked against the people that she was trying to help. We know that most people did not make it out of Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
There were a few specific things that she was able to do that meant the world to individual lives, even if they could not help on a wider scale. The first is visa extensions. I mentioned a few examples, but as early as 1933, she suggested to FDR that if somebody was German and Jewish on a visa in the US, that they should automatically get to stay. He did not take her idea in 1933. He did 5 years later after Kristallnacht, because the Night of Broken Glass made headlines across the US and across the world. And he made that announcement, and she had originally suggested it. I don't think she even cared that the idea originally came from her, to be honest. It's just not how she operated. But that is where the idea came from, and he made that policy through a press conference after Kristallnacht. And she had been extending people's visas behind the scenes already for a few years. Another way that she helped was by creating what historians, or I guess policy people at the time, called the corporate affidavit, which is just a fancy way of saying that a group of people could sponsor an immigrant instead of just an individual. So it enabled organizations like, for example, the German Jewish Children's Aid Incorporated to be a group, a corporation, literally, that did work and paid people to manage a child refugee program in collaboration with Perkins's Department of Labor, the INS, but also especially the Children's Bureau, which recorded and managed details for any children in the US, including immigrant children. And that was the other example I wanted to highlight, which is the Child Refugees Program. in 1933, she had advocated for something called a charge bond, which meant that an individual was able to put up a sum of money and the Secretary of Labor could accept it, deposit into the U.S. Postal Savings Bank to ensure that an immigrant or refugee would not become a burden on the U.S. economy. But she did not end up using that in the specific way that she wanted to in 1933. However, once Jewish activist groups heard that that was something that Perkins could legally do, it evolved through a series of complicated conversations in 1933, 1934, to a child refugee program that kicked off in November 1934 when the first ship of refugee children came to New York through this program. Perkins, the Children's Bureau, and under a woman named Catherine Lenroot, who oversaw the Children's Bureau, and the German Jewish Children's Aid Incorporated, under the leadership of a woman named Cecilia Rozovsky. All these women activists worked together to welcome child refugees into the country, and they saved several hundred individual lives from 1934 to 1941. And then the program evolved into something else once World War II began.
Yeah. Well, what a significant and impactful and creative intervention. And what I take from what you're describing, Rebecca, is that Frances Perkins was really good at working within the system to find ways to get around the system, which strikes me as brilliant and very effective. Bravo, Frances Perkins. Well, you know, Rebecca, this is also fascinating. It adds to the dimensions of Frances Perkins that we may have been familiar with from American history. FDR, Secretary of Labor, first female cabinet secretary. What do you think, from your book, people will learn about Frances Perkins as a person that they might not have understood before, even if they knew about her accomplishments?
As we've discussed throughout this conversation, she was not consistently able to help. But what was consistent about Perkins throughout the story of her refugee policy is that she was willing to try. And showed this over and over again. I didn't even mention that there was a resolution to impeach her at one point, and it was for not deporting an alleged communist. And so with that aside, that was in, it was actually in 1935, but then the resolution to impeach her was in 1939. But after 1939, she was still going out of her way to ensure that communists had a fair immigration policy experience. So when people wrote to her, they had good reason to believe that she would try. So that's one thing that my book reinforces about Perkins. But another objective that I see my book doing is, because her effort is consistent, we can learn a lot about all the obstacles that were in the way. Congress, the State Department, enormous segments of the American public who were anti-Semitic and xenophobic and isolationists. And that's what her 1930s were like.
Well, you've just started answering this question. I wanted to find out from you what you think people will learn about American history that they might not have fully understood before, the extent of perhaps those things that you were just describing. But are there other things that you feel people will learn about this era of American history during which her efforts to aid immigrants and Jewish refugees will learn? They might not have fully understood either the intensity of it or the extensiveness of it.
Well, your questions lead well into each other, Mary.
Good.
I mentioned Congress, and that there were two bills that would have helped refugees that didn't even make it to a floor vote. One was to expand child refugee policy. They didn't want children. And the other was to open a separate immigration quota in Alaska, which is chapter 8, probably beyond the framing of this conversation. I mentioned the word quota, and that's one thing that readers can learn about U.S. history from my book from 1924 to 1965. Explicitly racist quotas that Congress people used racist pseudoscience to assemble governed how many people could immigrate from each country per year. So that's one example. I also mentioned the American public, and that's something that I think is really interesting because ordinary Americans elect all these people who are making policy. And a lot of the times when Congress is anti-immigrant, that's because the Americans who elected them were. And that's not like an editorializing comment. That's fact of what the American public overall wanted to see. So for me, theoretically, the central takeaway from my book is the delicate interplay between individuals and collectives. We have collective American public voting for people who don't want immigrants. We have individual lives in danger. We have a collective of refugees dying in the Holocaust with no place in the world to go. We have an individual in government who wanted to look out for people in need, but we also have structures that she tried to work in to make that happen. Tried, and in many cases could not succeed because they were stacked against trying to help. But then the last thing I want to say about that is that her whole thing throughout her career was, how can we reform collective structures? She wasn't focused on punishing the individual employer at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She was focused on making new laws and policies in the state of New York that would prevent something like that from happening collectively and structurally. So the questions that I hope emerge are, what can an individual do to entrench collective structures that will help and not hurt people in need? And Frances Perkins was truly a professional at that.
Well, that's fascinating, Rebecca, because what I think about as I hear you talk about that individual and collective and that relationship is that individuals can have a certain kind of fire, passion, and vision. And I think it's fair to call Frances Perkins a visionary, because what she saw was, if you can create new collective structures, you have a much vaster kind of power to change both practices that will be more humane, but hopefully also with that attitudes and gain support more broadly. That's preventive for future horrors to happen. And so it's that relationship. I think what it's making me think about is that individuals can be powerful if you have the commitment and that tenacity. And that's the other thing that comes through as you talk about Frances Perkins, is some kind of constitutional tenacity that must be wired to a kind of hope that people will eventually listen, and that you can come up with collective structures that people can be persuaded to buy into to create a collective good. So it's kind of an escalating moral improvement, I guess you could say. That's fascinating. I'm curious to find out, Rebecca, how were you impacted by the research that you did and the writing of this book?
The writing of the book changed my life in many, many ways that could be a whole conversation in itself. I mean, while I was writing, I was a full-time high school history teacher in the Washington area. Now I am a postdoctoral research associate working on a university-wide initiative at Brown University. There were also personal changes that led to that move. But to answer your question, what I really want to focus in on is that the process of writing the book added relationships to my life, and it also strengthened the ones that I already had. So for example, I am in touch with and speak to regularly people at the Frances Perkins Center that I interned for years ago. I had a Zoom call with the current director of my Jewish summer camp a few days ago to talk about how to bring in history to camp's vision of itself. I have had the pleasure and privilege of reconnecting with people who have influenced me and my work on this story, and that's been one of the most exciting pieces of getting to be an author.
Would it be fair, Rebecca, to say that you've been Frances Perkinized?
Why not?
If Frances Perkins were alive today, what do you think she'd be busy working on, and what strategies do you think she would use?
So you gave me this question in advance, Mary, and you're the first person who's given me this question, and it's a fun one because we don't know. We don't know what she would
Yeah.
They don't do counterfactuals. I did have fun coming up with a few issues that I think she would focus on. The first one is affordable health care.
Oh,
and
yes.
the reason I say that is because it was one of her original policy points in what she wanted to do as Secretary of Labor. It was the only one that she did not get started on. Of course, the U.S. did not have a federal health insurance option until the Obama administration. I think it was 2009 or 2010. So healthcare and the accessibility of effective healthcare really comes to mind as something that she would care about if she were around today. And the second point that I wrote down is very on brand for Perkins, which is workplace safety for the most marginalized.
Yeah. Both incredibly important issues, absolutely. And yeah, I take your point. Being the historian and having the integrity you do, you're not going to speculate. But I'm guessing, I'm guessing it would have something to do with that individual collective kind of relationship that you were talking about as being key to how she progressed. And she'd probably come up with some new structures and sponsoring some laws that would build support and galvanize kind of new practices that we could then hopefully institutionalize to the improvement and betterment of our lives, not just as workers, but as Americans and fundamentally as human beings. I've started sometimes saying to myself as on a hard news day, I go, WWFPD. What would Frances Perkins do? And I don't have the answer to that. But what I do remind myself is she wouldn't give up. And she wouldn't sit around and mope, which is where I can go, left to my own devices. So WWFPD is a new kind of motto of mine, and I think it would benefit all of us to adopt it. Rebecca, thank you so much. It's been really fun and fascinating to talk to you about Dear Miss Perkins. I really, really appreciate your taking the time to come on the morning show and teach us about who she was and what she did and why she did it. I learned so much from you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
And just a reminder, your book will be available everywhere on January 21st, and I can't wait to read it. And I want to learn about Alaska. I'm going to read Chapter 8 because that provokes my curiosity. Thank you.
January 21st, so before then it's available for pre-order wherever books are sold.
Excellent.
And after January 21st, it's published by Kensington and distributed by Penguin Random House.
Wonderful. And I know you're about to launch a very busy book tour, and I wish you all the success on your book tour and with your book. Thank you for writing it, Rebecca. You take care now. Farewell.